The document landed on the table between them with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in the room went still. Mabel Keller did not flinch. She did not blink. She stood with her spine perfectly straight, her dark eyes fixed on Cornelius Granger with an expression so composed it bordered on dangerous, and she waited. She had been waiting for 3 weeks. She could wait another 30 seconds while he processed what he was looking at. Cornelius Granger had faced down cattle stampedes, dust storms that swallowed the sky, and a man in Laramie who had drawn iron on him for no better reason than the color of his hat. He was not a man who rattled easily. But the paper beneath his hands, the sheaf of paper, rather, 12 pages of it, neat and precise and bound with a leather cord, rattled him down to the marrow. He looked up at her. His jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "You drafted a legal contract," he said. "It was not a question. It was the sound a man makes when the ground opens beneath his boots." "I did," Mabel said, "for the water rights. For the water rights, the grazing boundaries, the shared fence maintenance schedule, and the terms under which either party may dissolve the arrangement should either party breach the stated conditions." She paused. "It is witnessed, notarized, and a copy has already been filed with the territorial court in Cheyenne." The silence that followed was the kind that swallows men whole. Cornelius set the document back on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just realized they are holding something they cannot simply outmuscle. He looked at the woman across from him, the woman he had dismissed as a grieving daughter who would fold within a month of her father's death, and felt something shift so completely inside his chest that he was not sure he would ever be the same man again. He had thought her silence meant she had no plan. He had been profoundly, completely wrong. 3 weeks earlier, the sun had risen over the Sweetwater Basin like a slow fire being kindled at the edge of the world, and Mabel Keller had stood at the window of her father's ranch house, counting what she had left. One house, sound in its bones but worn at its edges. One barn, solid and warm. 437 acres of prime grazing land with a creek running through the center of it, the same creek that bordered Cornelius Granger's Triple G spread on its eastern flank. 12 cattle, 31 sheep, 2 horses, 1 mule named Howard who would not be reasoned with before 7 in the morning. And the knowledge pressed into her like type into paper that the neighboring rancher had been waiting for her father to die for the better part of 4 years. Her father, August Keller, had died on a Tuesday. He was 61 years old, weathered to the consistency of good oak, and he had managed to hold the Keller Ranch together with nothing more than determination and a borderline unreasonable stubbornness. He had also, in his final 2 years, borrowed against the land. Not heavily, not carelessly, but borrowed nonetheless, to replace the roof and to restock after the drought of 1882 thinned the herd to almost nothing. It was 1884 now, and the debt was modest but real, and Mabel knew that the moment Cornelius Granger understood the full picture of her finances, he would move on the water rights. He had been trying to acquire legal access to the Sweetwater Creek's upper fork for years. August had refused him at every turn, not from pure stubbornness, but because the water was survival. Without it, the eastern pastures dried to nothing by July. Without the eastern pastures, the ranch could not feed itself through winter. Without the ranch, Mabel had nothing. She was 27 years old. She had spent 6 of those years in an office in Denver, working as a legal clerk and land surveyor's assistant for a firm called Hargrove and Bell. She had learned to read deeds, draw boundary maps, file court motions, and draft preliminary contracts well enough that Mr. Hargrove had stopped triple-checking her work by the end of the 2nd year. She had returned to Wyoming 3 years ago, when August's health began its slow decline, and in that time she had done everything: maintained the land surveys, managed the accounts, negotiated with buyers, handled the payroll for the 2 ranch hands they employed, and kept the whole operation from sliding into the creek. She had also, every 6 months, reviewed the deed to the Keller Ranch with the same careful attention she had given every document that had crossed her desk in Denver. So when August died on that Tuesday in April, and the foreman of the Triple G Cattle Company came riding up the road on Wednesday morning with a message that Mr. Granger would appreciate a meeting at Mabel's earliest convenience, she had not been surprised. She had been ready. She had sent back a polite reply. She would be happy to meet with Mr. Granger. She simply needed a little time to settle her father's affairs. What she had done with that time was not something anyone on either ranch suspected. Cornelius Granger was, by most accounts in the Sweetwater Basin, a fair man. He ran 3,000 head of cattle on 12,000 acres, employed 22 men, paid them on time, and had never once been found on the wrong side of a legal dispute. He had come to Wyoming from Texas in 1875 at the age of 22, built his operation from a single cabin and $100 stake, and done it without treachery or force. He was not a villain. He was a pragmatist, which is sometimes more dangerous than a villain, because a pragmatist can justify almost anything with arithmetic. He was also, if anyone had asked, and no one had, a man who had been profoundly lonely for a very long time. He was 31 years old in the spring of 1884. He was over 6 feet tall, dark-haired, and built in a way that suggested his body had never once been allowed to remain idle long enough to soften. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the Wind River Range, dark gray eyes that tended to catch light in unsettling ways, and a way of moving through a room that made it clear he was always assessing, always calculating, always 2 steps ahead of whatever came next. He had been 2 steps ahead of almost everything in his life. Mabel Keller was the notable exception. He had met her, of course, over the years, at the trading post in Sweetwater, at the 4th of July gathering in town, across the fence line when boundary questions arose. He had always registered her as August's daughter, the competent one, the one who handled the books and kept the old man from making too many mistakes in his later years. He had admired her in the abstract way a man admires a well-built fence, with a recognition that it was quality work without any particular curiosity about the person who built it. That had been his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming that grief would flatten her. On the Thursday after August's death, Cornelius rode to the Keller Ranch himself. Not because he was impatient. He had told himself he was not impatient, but because leaving a young woman alone on a working ranch with only 2 hands to manage it seemed, to him, like the decent thing was to check on the situation. He told himself this so convincingly that he almost believed it by the time he reached her gate. Mabel was in the east pasture when he arrived, crouching beside the creek bed with a surveying rod planted in the ground and a compass in her hand, drawing something in a leather-bound notebook. She did not look up when he rode in, and his foreman, a lean and cautious man named Elias Beck, had told him about that habit of hers, the way she did not stop working for social niceties until she had finished what she was doing. He dismounted and walked to the fence. He waited. She finished writing, capped her pencil, closed the notebook, and then looked up at him with an expression that was perfectly civil and entirely opaque. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I appreciate you coming by." "Miss Keller," he took off his hat, "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man." "He was," she agreed, "the best." She crossed the pasture and extended her hand, and they shook, her grip firm and businesslike, her palm calloused in the way of someone who actually worked the land rather than simply owned it. "I understand you'd like to discuss the creek," she said. He had not expected her to open that particular door quite so directly, and something in his face must have flickered, because she saw it, and a very faint thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more like the recognition of a chess move. "Eventually," he said, which was not quite a lie. "I have some things to attend to before I can have that conversation properly," she said. "I hope you'll give me a few weeks." He had said yes, of course. He was not without manners, and a few weeks cost him nothing. He had waited 4 years already. But as he rode back to his ranch that afternoon, he could not quite shake the image of her in that field with her compass and her notebook, taking measurements he had not asked about and writing things he had not been able to see. He told himself it did not matter. She was a woman alone on a 400-acre spread with debt and a dry summer ahead. Whatever she was measuring, whatever she was writing, the arithmetic of the situation was what it was. He had, as already established, been wrong. The weeks that followed were strange and quietly electric in the way that charged air is before a storm you cannot yet see. Mabel went to town 3 times that Cornelius knew of, which was once to settle the estate paperwork, once to speak with the bank, and once for reasons he could not determine. His men reported seeing her at the land office. Elias Beck, who rode the fence line every other day and therefore had the clearest view of the neighboring spread, told him she was out in that pasture every morning for at least 2 hours with her instruments. "What's she measuring?" Cornelius asked. Elias shrugged. "Can't say, but she's thorough." It was the word thorough that Cornelius carried with him through those 3 weeks, the way you carry a stone in your boot. Noticeable, persistent, an ongoing reminder that something was not quite as simple as you had assumed. Meanwhile, the shape of his plan had taken form the way most of his plans did, practically, logically, without sentiment. He would offer her a fair price for access rights to the upper fork. Not ownership, simply access. A legal easement that would allow his cattle to water from her side of the creek during the peak summer months when his lower reservoir ran thin. He would offer her a payment substantial enough to make a real dent in whatever her father had owed, and she would accept it, because what other choice did a woman alone with 2 hands and 12 cattle really have? He had rehearsed the conversation. He knew exactly what he would say. He was, in all things, prepared. And then the document landed on the table. The meeting had been set for a Monday morning in May. Mabel had sent word through her ranch hand, a steady older man named Pete Dunmore, that she was ready to speak with Mr. Granger at his convenience. Cornelius had ridden over that morning feeling, he was not ashamed to admit, somewhat confident. The days of her silence had confirmed his reading of the situation. She was holding on barely, trying to appear composed. She had no particular leverage, no particular resources, and while she had that competent, observant quality about her that he found himself thinking about more often than was entirely professional, the facts of the situation were simply what they were. He had brought Elias along, witness and general presence. He had his own drafted proposal, clean and detailed, in the saddlebag. What he had not expected was to find, upon arriving at the Keller Ranch kitchen table, that Mabel Keller already had a document of her own. She had offered them coffee and a seat with perfect composure, poured 3 cups without spilling a drop, settled herself across the table, and then slid that leather-bound sheaf of paper across to him as though she were passing the sugar. He had read the first page in silence. He had turned to the second page. He had reached the third before he realized his coffee was getting cold, and he had not taken a single breath that he was aware of. The document was a water rights agreement. It was not a simple, one-line easement such as he had been prepared to offer her. It was a comprehensive, professionally structured legal agreement covering water access, grazing boundary definitions, fence maintenance schedules, drought provisions, seasonal rotation terms for cattle watering, and a dispute resolution clause that referenced both Wyoming territorial law and relevant federal land ordinances from the Land Act of 1877. It was the document of someone who had spent considerable time at a law office. He looked at the citation in the margin of page 4 and recognized the territorial court filing number. She had not been bluffing about Cheyenne. When he finally looked up, she was watching him with those dark, steady eyes, her coffee cup in her hand, her expression serene in the way of deep water. "You filed this already," he said. "I filed a copy," she confirmed. "As a preliminary record, the agreement itself requires both signatures to be binding." He sat back. Elias, beside him, had not moved since the second page. Even Elias, a man of exceptional calm, looked like he had been struck lightly between the eyes with a small and well-aimed object. "The terms," Cornelius said slowly, "are not what I expected." "No," Mabel said. "I suspected they would not be. You're offering me the easement." "I am offering you an easement," she said, with precisely the kind of emphasis that conveyed the distinction mattered. Specifically, access to the Upper Fork Creek bed between June 15th and September 30th, for no more than 800 head of cattle at any given time, at a daily access fee structured on a sliding scale based on current beef prices in Cheyenne, which you will find detailed in Appendix B, with an annual renegotiation clause that allows either party to adjust terms in light of changed conditions. He opened to Appendix B. Appendix B was, if anything, more detailed than the main agreement. "You structured this on market pricing," he said. "It seemed more equitable than a flat fee that favors one party depending on how prices move." She set her cup down. "Your cattle need the water. My land provides the water. The value of that provision should reflect the value of your product, since that product is what the water ultimately supports." Cornelius Granger had, in the 9 years since he built his ranch, negotiated contracts with cattle buyers, wool brokers, feed suppliers, equipment dealers, land agents, and 2 different banks. He was good at it. He was known to be good at it. Men came to him for advice on contracts because he had a clean and accurate eye for terms and value. He had never, in all of that, encountered a counter-proposal that was structurally more sophisticated than the one he had brought in his own saddlebag. He became aware, in a slow and slightly burning way, that the quiet that had followed her father's death had not been emptiness. It had been the sound of Mabel Keller working. "Where did you learn to draft documents like this?" he asked. "I worked as a legal clerk and land surveyor's assistant in Denver for 6 years, she said. "For a firm called Hargrove and Bell." He looked at her. He looked at the document. He looked at her again. "You surveyed the pasture," he said, as a piece of the puzzle shifted into place. "The last 3 weeks. You were redrawing the boundary maps." "Updating them," she said. "The original survey on record in Cheyenne was done in 1871 and contains 3 errors. I have corrected them and filed the updated survey alongside the preliminary agreement. You will find, Mr. Granger, that the corrected boundary actually places 14 additional feet of creek bed on Keller land, that the current record attributes incorrectly to Triple G." The silence that followed that statement was so complete that the sound of the coffee cooling in their cups was almost audible. Elias made a very small sound that was not quite a cough. Cornelius set the document down. He pressed his fingers flat against the table. He looked at Mabel Keller with the full and undivided attention of a man who has just realized that what he thought was a simple transaction has turned out to be something of an entirely different category, and what he felt, beneath the surprise, beneath the recalibration, beneath the professional recognition that he was looking at excellent legal work, was something warm and entirely unexpected. He was impressed. He was more than impressed. He was struck, somewhere central and genuine, by the quality of what she had done, the precision of it, the foresight, the sheer intellectual work of it, accomplished quietly and alone in the weeks after her father's death while he had been sitting at his own table assuming she was simply waiting for him to tell her what the situation was. She had not been waiting. She had been building. "I need to read this properly," he said at last. "Of course," Mabel said. She rose, collected the empty cups, and moved to the stove to refill the pot, leaving him and Elias to the document with the easy confidence of someone who had already accounted for whatever they would find in it. He read all 12 pages. Elias read over his shoulder. Twice, Cornelius backtracked to reread a clause he had not quite believed the first time. The fence maintenance schedule was particularly elegant, a shared cost structure weighted by usage, with a simple annual audit mechanism that prevented disputes from accumulating. The drought provision was the part that stopped him longest, because it demonstrated not only legal knowledge but a genuine understanding of what drought actually meant to ranching. The provision included a tiered reduction of access fees in direct proportion to creek flow levels, protecting his operations in the worst years and her income in the good ones. When he finished, he looked up to find her back in her chair, hands folded, watching him with the patient attention of someone who had done everything they could do and understood that the next move belonged to someone else. "I want to make 2 changes," he said. "I am open to discussing changes," she said. "What are they?" "The seasonal cutoff date. September 30th gives my cattle 10 days less than they typically need in a dry year. I'd like to extend to October 15th. She considered this. October 15th with a proviso that access reduces to 400 head maximum after October 1st to account for the creek's lower late-season flow and the impact on the eastern pasture's winter grass. He thought about this for roughly 4 seconds. It was fair. It was more than fair. It was the kind of accommodation that showed she was thinking about the land, not just the terms. "Agreed," he said. "The second change is the dispute resolution clause. You've cited territorial arbitration, which means a process that could take 6 months. In a ranching dispute, 6 months can mean the difference between a recoverable loss and a catastrophic one. I'd like to add a provision for an independent local mediator as a first step before territorial arbitration." She tilted her head slightly. "Who would you suggest as independent?" "Judge Calloway in Sweetwater." "Judge Calloway knows you," she pointed out. "He also knows your father and has nothing but good things to say about August Keller. I would accept that his familiarity with both operations makes him better qualified, not less." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her thinking, watched the precise and careful process of it in the way her eyes moved. Not restlessly, but with that focused quality of someone running through variables. "I would accept Judge Calloway with the provision that either party may, if unsatisfied with his mediation, proceed to territorial arbitration without waiver of rights." "Accepted," he said. She rose from the table and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the kitchen, where he could see that she already had a clean copy of the document prepared. Because of course she did, she had known there would be edits, and she made the 2 changes in a neat, clear hand, initialed each one, and slid the document back to him. He made the same initialing notations. He signed where she indicated. She signed. Elias signed as witness, wearing the expression of a man who has attended a cattle auction and come home with a thoroughbred. Mabel folded her copy and set it aside. She folded his copy and slid it across with the same unhurried manner she had done everything that morning. "I believe that covers it," she said. "I believe it does," Cornelius said. He rode back to the Triple G in a state of profound internal disruption, and for a man who prided himself on clarity, it was distinctly uncomfortable. He went over the morning the way he went over a new map, looking for the features, taking the measure of the terrain, understanding what he was dealing with. What he was dealing with, it became clear, was Mabel Keller, not August Keller's daughter, not a woman managing a struggling property, not a figure in a transaction. Mabel Keller, who had drafted a 12-page legal agreement in the weeks following her father's death, who had resurveyed 400 acres with professional instruments, who had discovered a boundary error that benefited her position and corrected it on the record before he could even make an offer, and who had sat across a kitchen table from him with coffee and perfect composure, and presented the whole thing like she was handing him the weather forecast. He had never met anyone quite like her. He had never, if he was honest with himself, and Cornelius Granger was almost always honest with himself, wanted to know someone as much as he wanted to know her. He went back 3 days later. He told himself it was to discuss the fence line delineation mentioned in Section 4 of the agreement, which required both parties to walk the boundary together and confirm the markers. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. She met him at the gate in her work clothes, practical dark skirt, a collarless shirt, boots that had clearly seen serious use, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she had her surveying rod already in hand. They walked the fence line together for 2 hours, covering the full eastern boundary with methodical attention, and somewhere in the middle of it, when they had stopped to record a marker position, and she was jotting figures in her notebook with the absorbed concentration of someone for whom numbers were a native language, Cornelius realized that he had forgotten entirely to think about the fence. He was thinking about the way she looked when she was working, the way her hands moved with precision and economy, the way she would stop, measure, note, and move on without wasted motion, without second-guessing, without the sideways glancing for approval that he had observed in so many people when they were performing a skill they were not certain of. She was certain. She had the certainty of someone who had done this particular thing many hundreds of times and knew exactly how well she did it. "Your father taught you surveying?" he asked. She looked up briefly. "The basics. Enough to read a map and understand what I was looking at. The professional training I got in Denver." She made another notation. "Mr. Bell, that was the senior partner at Hargrove and Bell. He had a policy of not limiting what clerks could learn. He said ignorant assistants made expensive mistakes." A pause, quiet and dry. He was right. Most law offices don't let clerks draft documents. Most law offices don't have a clerk who asks to do it on her own time without pay to learn. She moved the rod to the next marker. "Mr. Hargrove was skeptical at first. He reviewed everything I drafted very carefully. After about a year, he stopped revising them." "How old were you when you went to Denver?" 21. She looked up at him with those clear, dark eyes. "My mother died when I was 18. My father was managing all right on his own, and I had a restlessness that Wyoming wasn't satisfying." She considered this. "I thought I would stay in Denver, make a proper career of it. Law is changing. More offices are willing to employ women in real capacities, not just decorative ones. But then father's health started and I came back." "Do you regret it?" She thought about this honestly, which he was beginning to understand was the only way she engaged with questions. "No," she said. "I thought I would. But this land is. It's not something you can fully explain to people who haven't grown up watching the light change over it through 4 seasons." She looked out across the pasture, which was that particular shade of early spring green that would not last another 6 weeks before the summer came in and changed everything. "I regret that I could not do both, but I do not regret coming back." They walked in silence for a while. The creek murmured beside them, running full with snowmelt from the higher country, and a meadowlark somewhere in the grass was conducting a complicated argument with itself. "Your people are from here?" she asked. "Wyoming, I mean. Texas originally. I came up the trail when I was 18, worked 3 years on a drive before I had enough to stake my own claim." "What made you stay in Wyoming rather than Texas?" He thought about it. "Space," he said. "Texas is full of men who got there first and aren't inclined to share. Wyoming still had room to breathe." She nodded slowly. "It's a particular quality of this country, the scale of it." She tapped her pencil against her notebook. "I always thought that was why father never wanted to leave even when things were hard. You can think more clearly when you can see to the horizon." Cornelius looked at the horizon. He looked at her. He was beginning to develop the distinct and slightly alarming sense that he had been coming to this fence line, meeting for a reason that had very little to do with fence lines. He came back again the following week, on a morning when he had no particular excuse, and was direct enough with himself about it that he did not bother inventing one. He simply rode over and knocked on the door. She opened it with ink on her hands, which meant she had been writing, and a small line between her brows that smoothed when she saw him, which he noted with the same attention he gave to significant weather. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I brought something." He held up the paper-wrapped package in his hand. "Mrs. Yardley at the trading post had her coffee order come in. I told her you'd mentioned being low." He had not actually heard her mention it. He had simply seen, when he glanced through her kitchen window that Monday morning, that the coffee canister on the shelf was thin on contents. He was not sure, as he stood at her door with a package of coffee, whether this observation made him thoughtful or simply intrusive. She looked at the package, then at him. The corner of her mouth did that thing again, the thing that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Come in," she said. She made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table. which was now clear of legal documents, and covered instead with the survey notes she had apparently been transcribing. She did not move these as one would move them to hide them. She simply shifted them to the side to make room for the cups, as a person does when the work is simply ongoing and nothing about it is a secret. He picked up one of the sheets, more from habit than intention. It was a detailed elevation sketch of the creek bed, marked with depth measurements and current flow notations. "You're mapping the water levels," he said. "Drought record," she said from the stove. "I want a baseline so that, when we invoke the drought provision in Section 7, we have clear data from before the summer started rather than disputing what normal flow looked like." She poured the coffee and brought both cups to the table. "It protects both of us." He looked at the notes. He looked at her. Something was happening in the vicinity of his chest that he was not entirely prepared to name but was becoming increasingly unable to ignore. "Miss Keller," he said, "I would like to ask you something." She sat down and folded her hands around her cup in that way she had, composed and ready. "All right. Would you be willing to have supper with me, not to discuss the agreement? Not the ranch or the fence line or the water levels." He paused. "Just supper." She was quiet for a moment. He did not rush her because he was learning already that she deserved the time she needed to think, and that her thinking was always worth waiting for. "Where?" she asked. "The hotel in Sweetwater has a dining room. It is not especially grand, but the food is reliable." She considered this for a moment more. "Saturday," she said. "I have a delivery of feed arriving Friday and I'll need the morning to sort it." "Saturday is fine," he said, and felt something loosen in his chest. Something he had not known was held tight until it released. Saturday came around, and Cornelius arrived at the Keller Ranch at 6 in the evening, driving a borrowed wagon because the hotel in Sweetwater was 7 miles of uneven road, and a horse was no way to transport a woman in her good clothes without subsequent apologies. He was wearing his best jacket, which was dark wool, and fitted in a way that Elias Beck had noted privately made him look like he was trying. Cornelius had told Elias to mind his own business, which Elias had accepted with the patience of a man who had worked for Cornelius for 6 years and had learned which battles were worth choosing. Mabel came to the door in a dress the color of dark wine, her hair pinned up with the kind of elegant efficiency that suggested she had done it quickly and practically, and had no idea how striking the result was. Or perhaps she knew and simply did not make a production of it, which was more characteristic. She looked at the wagon. She looked at him. He watched her absorb the detail, the wagon rather than horses, the clear thinking behind it, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was small but definite. "You brought a wagon," she said. "The road's rough," he said simply. She took his offered hand to climb up, and then they were side by side on the bench, 7 miles ahead of them, and the evening sky was turning colors over the basin that had no names for their specific shades in any language that Cornelius knew. They talked for the full 7 miles, not about the ranch, not about contracts or water rights or fence lines. He asked about Denver, and she told him about the city with the precise eye of someone who had looked at it carefully rather than romantically. The growth of it, the way the railroad had changed it, the particular quality of its winter light compared to Wyoming's, the surprising greenness of the parks in summer. He told her about Texas, about the cattle drives, about the strange and specific freedom of 3 months on open trail with nothing to worry about but the herd and the weather. "You miss it sometimes," she said. It was not a question. "The freedom of it," he said. "Not the hardship, but the clarity. When there is only one thing to think about, you think about it very clearly." "I felt that way about survey work," she said. "When you are taking measurements, there is only the measurement. There is nothing else to calculate." He looked at her profile in the fading light. "Do you miss the office?" She considered this. "I miss the intellectual engagement of it. The law is, there is a real and serious beauty to a well-constructed legal argument. The way a good contract anticipates every variable, closes every gap, creates a fair structure that protects all parties from their own worst impulses." She paused. That sounds cold. It does not feel cold from the inside. It doesn't sound cold, he said. It sounds like something you genuinely love. She turned to look at him then with an expression of open surprise, the first genuinely unguarded expression he had seen from her, as though she had not expected to be understood quite so directly. Yes, she said, I suppose it is. The hotel dining room in Sweetwater was, as advertised, not especially grand. It had 6 tables with white cloths that had been white long enough to have achieved a dignified ivory, 2 windows that looked onto the main street, and a menu that offered 3 choices and meant all of them. The proprietor's wife, who managed the kitchen and the dining room simultaneously with the multitasking efficiency of someone running a small military operation, seated them with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen many things and intended to discuss all of them with the right people later. Cornelius ordered the beef stew because he had eaten it before and trusted it. Mabel ordered the same, which he appreciated without quite knowing why, the absence of performance in the choice, maybe. The sense that she was not trying to impress him with anything other than herself. They talked through supper with the same ease that had marked the wagon ride, moving through topics without agenda, finding unexpected connections. He had read more than people assumed ranch life had long winters, and a man needed something to do with them. She had a particular interest in geology, which she had studied independently through journals and the occasional book from Denver's lending library. They discovered they had both read the same geological survey of the Wyoming territory published the previous year, and spent 20 minutes on it with the enthusiasm of people who have unexpectedly found someone to discuss a shared interest with, which is one of the rarest and best surprises adult life offers. When the proprietor's wife brought coffee and pie without being asked, which was either a compliment or an omen, Cornelius leaned back in his chair and looked at Mabel with an openness he had not intended but could not quite suppress. I owe you an apology, he said. She tilted her head slightly. For what? When your father died, I thought, he stopped and was honest with himself before he continued, which was the only way to say this right. I thought you were in a difficult position, and I intended to offer you a deal that was reasonable but that benefited me considerably more than it benefited you. I thought your silence in those first weeks meant you were uncertain, that you didn't have a plan. She looked at him steadily. I was wrong, he said. And I want to acknowledge that directly because you deserved better than the assumption I made. The quiet that followed was the kind that has texture warm and slightly surprised. Thank you, she said. That is, genuinely, thank you. The document you drafted was better than anything I brought, he said. That's not a thing I say easily. I know, she said, with a dry warmth that made him want to laugh, and so he did. They drove back under stars so thick and close in the Wyoming sky that they seemed almost architectural, as though the darkness above the basin had been designed to contain them. The air had gone cold the way it does in the high country even in May, and Mabel had a shawl, but it was insufficient for the drop in temperature. And at some point around mile 4, she stopped pretending she was warm enough, and Cornelius, wordlessly, removed his jacket and put it around her shoulders without making it a moment. Did not protest. She pulled the jacket closer, which smelled like horses and wood smoke and something clean, and looked at the stars. What's the star in the south? She asked. The bright one. Jupiter, he said. Not a star, a planet. I know it's a planet, she said with the mildness of someone correcting a small error without malice. I meant the actual star behind it and to the left. He squinted. Antares, he said after a moment. She nodded. Heart of the Scorpion. You know your stars. The survey work requires celestial navigation for accurate positioning, she said. But yes. I also simply like them. She looked up a moment longer. My mother used to say the stars were the permanent things. Everything on the ground changes. The stars stay where they are. He thought about that. He thought about his own mother who had died when he was 15 and the particular kind of orphan quality that early loss gives a person, the way it makes you careful with permanent things, aware of their rarity. She sounds like she was a thoughtful woman, he said. She was, Mabel said. Both my parents were thoughtful people. A pause. I think that is the best inheritance I could have had. Not the land, though I'm grateful for that too, just the example of how they moved through the world. With intention, he said. She turned and looked at him in the dark. Yes. He drove her back to her gate and helped her down from the wagon, and her hand in his was warm in a way that registered somewhere below conscious thought. She gave him back his jacket and he stood holding it, watching her walk to her porch, and she turned at the door. Thank you, Mr. Granger, she said. Cornelius, he said. He had not planned to say it. He said it anyway. She considered this in the way she considered everything, with full attention and honest deliberateness. Thank you, Cornelius, she said. Good night. He drove home with his jacket in his lap, and the particular internal brightness of a man who has sat across a table from someone extraordinary and understood, in the clear and grounded part of him that did not often speak in abstractions, that this was a specific and irreplaceable kind of luck. Summer arrived in the Sweetwater Basin with its characteristic lack of apology, rolling across the grassland in a wave of heat that started in late June and did not relent until September. The creek, as Mabel had mapped and anticipated, ran lower than the previous 2 years, a consequence of a thin snowpack in the mountains to the west, and the drought provision in Section 7 was invoked precisely as she had designed it, smoothly and without dispute, reducing the access fees proportionally, and preventing any resentment from accumulating on either side. What accumulated instead, with the same quiet inevitability as the summer heat, was something neither of them had proposed a contract for. Cornelius found reasons to ride to the Keller Ranch that he could not always justify with ranch business. Mabel found that she did not particularly object to this. They ate supper together twice more at the hotel in Sweetwater, once with Elias Beck and Pete Dunmore, along in a gathering that was ostensibly practical and was functionally something warmer. On the 4th of July, the whole basin gathered in town for the community celebration, and Cornelius spent most of it within the gravitational pull of wherever Mabel happened to be standing, which was not a deliberate choice so much as a natural phenomenon. At one point during the afternoon, a dispute broke out between 2 ranchers on the far side of town over the ownership of a stray yearling, and it was escalating toward the kind of noise that ended in embarrassment or worse when Mabel, who had been watching from nearby with the alert attention she gave to most things, walked into the middle of it and very calmly asked both men to describe their branding marks. She had each man draw his brand in the dust with a stick. She then pointed out that the yearling's brand, while worn by Summer, was clearly the configuration of one and not the other, and offered to write a brief statement to that effect for the county record if either man wanted it. Both men looked at her for a moment, recalibrated everything they had been planning to do, and shook hands. Cornelius watched this from 20 feet away with the full warmth of the July afternoon pouring down and something entirely different, entirely interior, pouring through him. He was in love with her. He knew it with the same clean certainty with which he had always known the things that mattered: his land, his work, his word. It was not a gradual or uncertain knowledge. It was the kind of thing that arrives like a boundary marker, a point you reach, and having reached it, know that you have been traveling toward it for some time. The question was what to do with it, and here he was somewhat less clear, because Mabel Keller was not a woman with whom you could proceed by assumption. He had already learned, with some instructive force, what happened when he proceeded with her by assumption. He thought about it through the rest of July and into August, while the summer bore down and the creek ran low, and his cattle watered from her pasture under the terms of the agreement that she had built from scratch, and which continued to function with the elegant reliability of good engineering. The decision, when it finally came, was made on a morning in late August when he rode to the Keller Ranch, not on a pretext, but simply because he had made a decision to stop proceeding by indirection with a woman who had made it clear she valued directness. She was at the creek, checking her water level measurements, which she did every 2 weeks without fail, and she looked up when she heard his horse and held her place without the particular surprise of someone whose visitor was entirely unexpected. He dismounted and walked to where she stood at the creek's edge. The water was running thin and amber clear, and the cottonwoods along the bank were beginning that first slight yellowing at the edges that would deepen into gold by September. "I need to speak with you," he said. "All right," she said. She lowered her measuring rod and gave him her full attention, which was one of the things he loved about her, the completeness of her attention when she gave it. There was no performance of listening, no social approximation of it. She simply listened. "I am not a man who speaks easily about interior things," he said. "But I've learned, from you as much as from anyone, that proceeding without stating your terms is a way of disadvantaging both parties." Something moved in her expression. Not her face remained composed, but something behind it. "So let me state my terms clearly," he continued. "I am not interested in anything convenient or practical. I am not interested in anything that serves the ranch or simplifies a business arrangement. I am interested in you, Mabel. In the specific, particular way that means I would like to know you for the rest of my life, and I am asking whether you would consider that." The creek moved past them with its late summer voice, lower than it would be in spring but still talking. A hawk crossed the sky to the north, so far up it was a silhouette rather than a creature. Mabel looked at him for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes, and he did not look away because this was not a moment for looking away. "You have been thinking about this for some time," she said. It was not quite a question. "Since about the second week of May," he said, "give or take a day." "Since the contract meeting," she said. "Since I read the drought provision in Section 7, he said, "and understood that you had constructed something designed to be fair rather than favorable, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be." She was quiet. He waited with the patience he had developed in years of working with weather and animals and things that moved on their own schedule. "I have not been neutral about you," she said carefully, "since some point in May that I have not precisely identified." "That is an extremely carefully worded statement," he said. "I am an extremely careful person." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be less careful. I am asking if your careful assessment of the situation has reached any conclusions." A beat. 2. "It has," she said, and I would like to continue knowing you," she said, "for a significant period of time." He felt the smile start before he had quite decided to allow it. "That is also an extremely carefully worded statement." "Cornelius," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice was a thing he filed away immediately in the category of things worth keeping. "I am telling you yes. I am simply also telling you that I would like us to be clear-eyed about it because I do not do things halfway and I want you to know what you are agreeing to before you agree to it." "Tell me," he said. "I will always manage my own affairs," she said. "The ranch is mine. I will accept advice and assistance gladly, but I will not accept being overruled on decisions that are mine to make." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "I have my own opinions which I will voice. I will listen to yours with genuine attention, and I expect the same in return." "Also agreed. And I intend to continue the water level monitoring through at least the next 3 years to establish a proper drought baseline, which means I will be in that creek bed every 2 weeks regardless of weather or social calendar." He looked at her. He had the very clear, very certain sense that he was being offered something extraordinary by someone who was making sure he understood what he was choosing. "Mabel," he said, "I am the man who rode to your ranch with a saddlebag full of contract terms and found out you had already filed the better version in Cheyenne. I know exactly what I am choosing." The thing that happened to her face then was not the careful, composed expression he had grown accustomed to. It was something much less guarded, much warmer, and much more itself. The actual expression underneath all the others, which was intelligent and warm and slightly wondering, and which he hoped, with deep sincerity, to spend a very long time earning. She extended her hand, which was her way of confirming things. He shook it and then, because he was also his own kind of deliberate. He raised it to his mouth and pressed a brief and gentle kiss to her knuckles, watching her face over the top of her hand as he did it. She did not object. She looked at him with those eyes and said, very composedly, "That was not in the terms." "I'm proposing an amendment," he said. "I'll take it under consideration," she said, and the corner of her mouth did the thing it always did, and this time he recognized it correctly as the smile she kept most of the time for herself, the one that was real and unperformed and entirely her. September came in gold and slow, and the cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek burned down from yellow to amber to the particular deep copper that is the finest color the Wyoming fall produces. Mabel's measurements showed the creek recovering its levels, and the drought provision in Section 7 was retired for the season, the final payment calculated to the cent and delivered by Cornelius personally, in cash, with a note that read only, per Appendix B, which she had read and immediately pressed her lips together and looked away, which he had observed with considerable private satisfaction. He came for supper at the Keller Ranch on Thursday evenings, which became a pattern established not by agreement but by the natural accumulation of Thursday evenings, where it felt like the right thing to do. She cooked with the same efficiency she brought to everything simple, well-considered food that was better than it announced itself to be. And he brought things when he thought of them. Coffee, because he remained observant about the canister on her shelf. A sack of dried apples in September because she had mentioned liking them. A new volume on Wyoming's geological formations that he had ordered from a bookseller in Denver 3 weeks earlier and had not told her about. When she opened that particular package, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday in October, she looked at the cover and then at him and said, with a completeness of feeling she did not usually allow to surface that quickly, "Cornelius." "It's the new edition," he said. "The 1884 survey was updated in the spring." She looked down at the book, and he could see from the way she held it carefully, both hands, the way you hold something that genuinely matters, that it had landed in exactly the right place. "Thank you," she said, and the two words carried a weight that had very little to do with geology. He was discovering, become very good at reading what her careful words actually meant. October turned to November, and the weather changed its character in the way Wyoming weather does decisively, without negotiation. The first snow came in the 3rd week of October, a dusting that melted by midday, followed 2 weeks later by a serious snowfall that filled the fence lines and turned the basin white and changed the whole quality of light and sound. The creek, now running with autumn volume, was banked by ice on its edges every morning. On a Monday in the 1st week of November, Cornelius arrived at the Keller Ranch in the early afternoon to find that Pete Dunmore had injured his wrist in a fence repair gone wrong, that the second hand, a young man named Colby who had only been hired in September, was down with a fever, and that Mabel was attempting to manage the feed distribution, and the cattle count and the fence repair herself in wind that had come down from the northwest carrying the first edge of real winter in it. He didn't say anything. He tied his horse, took off his good coat, put on the work gloves from his saddlebag and went to help. They worked for 4 hours in the diminishing light and the increasing cold, and she worked beside him without pretense or decoration, moving the way she always moved purposefully, without wasted motion, doing what needed doing. He mended the section of fence with the proficiency of someone who had built and repaired fence since he was a boy, and she held the wire and handed him tools with the synchronicity of someone who understood exactly what the job required. By the time they finished, the light was gone and the temperature had dropped to a place that suggested remaining outdoors was no longer wise advice. She led the way inside and made coffee with the air of someone who needed heat in their hands immediately, and he sat at the kitchen table and felt the cold work its way out of him in the warmth of her kitchen and thought, "This is what I want, this specific thing, not an abstraction. This kitchen, this woman, this cold November dark outside the window. I want to ask you something," he said. She set the coffee on the table and sat, She gave him her eyes. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I understand that you have terms, and I want you to know that your terms are acceptable to me before you give me your answer. The ranch is yours. Your decisions about the ranch are yours. Your work, the survey work, the legal work, anything you want to do with the skills you've built is yours. I'm not asking you to trade any of that. I'm asking to be beside you in it." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the wind had settled into the steady push of a proper winter night, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses was moving in its stall with the slow shifts of a comfortable animal. Mabel looked at him for a long time. Not with uncertainty. He could read her well enough now to know that what she was doing was not weighing whether, but arranging how. She was being precise with herself, the way she was always precise, making sure that what she said was exactly what she meant. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath he had not quite known he was holding. "One condition," she said, "name it." "We file the property deed correctly before the wedding," she said. "I want the legal structure clear before we change the personal one. The ranch should remain in my name, and I want that recorded, not just understood between us." He felt for about the third time in his acquaintance with Mabel Keller the warm and entirely grounding force of being with someone who understood exactly what mattered and was not ashamed to say so. "Done," he said. "We'll go to the land office together." "Together," she agreed. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, not in the way of the initial handshakes, not businesslike, not measured, but in the way of something chosen, something settled, something that had traveled a particular distance to arrive exactly where it was. They married on the 14th of December, 1884, at the small church in Sweetwater, in the presence of about 40 people who represented most of the working population of the Sweetwater Basin. The minister was a serious man named Reverend Hobart who had, in his years in Wyoming, developed a practical theology suited to the people he served, direct, warm, and blessedly brief. The ceremony was clean and honest, which suited them both. Mabel wore a dark green dress, which she had ordered from the dressmaker in town 2 weeks prior, and which had arrived, to everyone's relief, on time. She carried a small bundle of dried wildflowers that she had pressed herself from the summer's growth along the creek bank, which was so purely characteristic of her that several of the women in attendance had to manage their expressions. Cornelius wore his best dark suit, which Elias Beck had quietly ensured was pressed and presentable, and he stood at the front of that small church and watched Mabel walk down the aisle with the composure of a man who is very certain of what he is about to do and finds that certainty itself a kind of joy. When Reverend Hobart asked whether he took this woman, Cornelius said yes with the full conviction of a man who had never said anything more honestly in his life. When Reverend Hobart asked whether she took this man, Mabel said yes in the same clear, deliberate voice she used for everything that mattered, and the room felt the weight of it and was glad. The reception was held at the hotel, which expanded its dining room for the occasion by moving all the tables to the walls and distributing a great deal of food and a reasonable quantity of whiskey. There was a fiddle player named Morrison who had a gift for setting a room in motion, and the dancing went on until well past what anyone in the basin generally considered an appropriate hour on a December weeknight. Mabel danced with Cornelius 4 times, which was twice more than she danced with anyone else, and during the second dance, a slower one that Morrison had found somewhere at the bottom of his repertoire, with a melody like something you half remember from childhood, she allowed herself, for perhaps the first time in Cornelius Granger's company, to lean her head briefly against his shoulder and close her eyes. He tightened his hand on her back the smallest amount, and that was all, and it was entirely sufficient. Pete Dunmore, watching from the side of the room with his healed wrist and a glass of something amber, made a remark to Elias Beck that was mostly lost to the sound of the fiddle, but contained the word finally. Elias Beck said nothing. He was, as previously noted, a man of exceptional calm. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a serious one, which Wyoming winters often are, but it settled over the Sweetwater Basin with an almost domestic quality for the two ranches that were now, in the practical daily sense of things, operating as one cooperative enterprise. Cornelius had not moved to the Keller Ranch. The Triple G was a larger operation and required his daily presence. But the distance between the two properties, 7 miles by road and somewhat less as the crow or the determined rancher traveled it, became the kind of distance covered without much thought, as needed, in either direction. In January, during a 3-day blizzard that sealed everyone indoors, Mabel worked on an article she had begun in December, a clear, practical explanation of the drought provision structure she had developed for the Water Rights Agreement, intended for submission to the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Review, a publication that went to ranch owners and land agents across the territory. She had not told Cornelius about it before she finished it, and she showed it to him on the 4th day when the storm had passed and the world outside was white and silent and the kitchen was warm. He read it carefully. When he finished, he looked at her across the table. "This is excellent," he said. "I want to submit it," she said. "Other operations are having the same drought conflicts. If the framework is useful, there's no reason to keep it private." He was quiet for a moment. "You'll want to publish under your name. Mabel Keller Granger," she said. "Both names." "That's your right," he said. And then, because he meant it entirely, "I think you should." The article was submitted in February and accepted in March. It ran in the April issue of the Review, and was, from what Cornelius gathered through the channels of territory-wide conversation that passed through places like trading posts and cattle markets and the bar at the hotel, read with considerable attention. 3 other ranch operators in the territory wrote to the Review requesting the full contract template. Mabel wrote back to each of them with the template and a brief note explaining the indexing mechanism. She charged nothing for it. When Cornelius raised an eyebrow at this, she said she had not built it to make a profit and saw no reason to start charging for it now. He considered this, found it consistent with everything he knew of her, and let it go. Spring came back to the basin like a returning traveler, bringing green and light, and the sound of the creek running full again. The fence line was walked for the first time as a married couple's joint property, and the markers, confirmed and recorded and filed correctly, stood exactly where Mabel had placed them the previous spring. In May, exactly 1 year after the morning, she had slid a 12-page legal agreement across a kitchen table and rearranged Cornelius Granger's understanding of the world. She told him, on an evening when the last of the light was going pink and lavender over the basin, that she was expecting their first child. He went very still for a moment. Then he pulled her into his arms with a careful thoroughness, his face against her hair, and said nothing for a full minute because there was nothing to say that the embrace did not say more accurately. "Are you well?" he asked eventually, pulling back enough to look at her face with the focused concern of a man who has learned to take the welfare of the things he loves seriously. "Entirely," she said. "I confirmed it with Dr. Patterson last week." She paused. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." "Of course you did," he said, with the warmth of full recognition. A boy was born in December of 1885, during a snowstorm that arrived with unhelpful timing and departed after 12 hours having delivered, in addition to approximately 4 inches of snow, one James August Granger August for the grandfather who had held the land and built the woman who built the agreement, and James because Mabel had always liked the weight of it, the simplicity. Dr. Patterson attended. Cornelius was present and quietly destroyed himself with worry in the way of new fathers throughout all of human history, and Pete Dunmore and Elias Beck waited in the kitchen and drank coffee in the manner of men who have no purpose and nowhere else to be. James August Granger came into the world with considerable vocal opinion about the experience, which Mabel handled with the composure she brought to everything, and which Cornelius handled by sitting beside her and holding her hand and being entirely, unambiguously present. When it was done, and the child was cleaned and wrapped and placed in Mabel's arms, she looked down at the small, furious face of her son and then up at Cornelius, and the expression on her face was not the composed, careful expression of the woman at the kitchen table with the legal contract. It was something altogether more open, deeply happy, slightly awed, entirely genuine. "Hello, James," she said to the baby. James voiced further opinions. "He has things to say," Cornelius observed. "He is a Keller," Mabel said, with the first humor of the post-birth hours. "We tend to," he laughed, and it was the laugh of a man who is so profoundly grateful that laughter is the only container large enough for it. The years that followed were good ones, in the deep and full sense of the word good, not without difficulty, because ranching in Wyoming in the 1880s was not a life that permitted complacency, but good in the way of lives lived with intention and intelligence and genuine partnership. The water rights agreement continued to function precisely as designed. When the great drought of 1886 and 1887 brought hardship across the basin, and much of the territory part of the broader catastrophe that ranchers called the Big Die-Up, when temperatures and conditions devastated cattle operations across the northern plains, the drought provision in Section 7 proved its value in ways that went beyond anything Mabel had specifically anticipated when she wrote it. The tiered reduction structure protected both operations from the kind of financial conflict that destroyed partnerships between neighboring ranchers elsewhere in the territory. They pulled through together, sharing resources in ways that the agreement made structurally clear and emotionally uncomplicated. Other ranchers in the basin were not all so lucky. Some lost their herds. Some lost their land. One family, the Hendrys, on the far side of the basin lost everything and had to move east. Mabel worked with them before they left, helping them understand their legal options regarding the debt, and it cost her 3 weeks of intensive work and a considerable amount of her own energy, and she accepted no payment for it. She began, in the quiet deliberateness that characterized everything she did, to take on additional legal assistance work for people in the Sweetwater Basin who needed it. Not as an attorney, she had not been admitted to the territorial bar, and the bar in Wyoming territory was, in 1887, not in the practice of admitting women, but as a practical consultant on land documents and water rights, which were the two issues that caused the most conflict and the most loss in the ranch country of the West. She charged people what they could afford and sometimes nothing, and she developed over several years a reputation that extended beyond the basin. Cornelius watched all of this with an uncomplicated pride. He was not always temperamentally matched to the patience her work required. He was, by nature and by training, a man who moved quickly and acted on what he could see, but he had learned in the school of Mabel Keller Granger that preparation and precision were not slowness. They were a different kind of speed, and they arrived at better destinations. He expanded the Triple G gradually, purchasing an adjacent spread in 1886 when its owner, a bachelor rancher named Fitch, decided Wyoming winters had exceeded his tolerance and sold out for a fair price. The expansion brought the total acreage of the Triple G to just under 15,000 acres, which was, Elias Beck observed, a substantial operation by any measure. Cornelius ran it with the same practical directness he always had, but there were changes in his operations that people in the basin noticed and occasionally mentioned. The way he structured contracts with his suppliers, for instance, which had a new precision and fairness about them. The way he handled disputes, which now consistently included a mediation step before any adversarial position was taken. He did not take credit for any of this. The credit, as was appropriate, belonged to the woman who had taught him what good structure actually looked like. A daughter arrived in 1888, born in July when the basin was at its most extravagant, every grass seed and wildflower and creek bank cottonwood expressing itself with the full conviction of summer. They named her Clara Rose Clara for a friend of Mabel's from Denver. Rose because Cornelius had asked if he could choose something and Mabel had said yes, and he had thought about it for 2 weeks and come back with Rose, because it was his mother's name, and he had wanted for a long time to place it somewhere it would grow. When he told her that, she looked at him with the expression that was her full, real self, the one without the careful composure, the one that was simply Mabel, and she said, "Then Rose it is." James grew from an infant with opinions into a boy with a great deal of energy and a remarkable natural ease with animals that was clearly not inherited from either parent's primary skill set and was therefore, they concluded, entirely his own. By the time he was 4, he had made a friend of every horse on the property, including Howard the mule, who had mellowed somewhat in his old age but remained, at his core, an unreasonable creature before 7 in the morning. Clara Rose proved, at an early age, to have her mother's particular quality of silent, focused attention, the ability to observe without announcing herself, to sit quietly at the edge of adult conversations and absorb them with her large dark eyes. She also had Cornelius's jaw, which was a formidable thing on a small child, and his gray eyes, which on her looked like stormy water. She was, even at 1 and 2 years old, a presence in a room. Mabel published a second article in the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Review in 1889, this one on boundary survey errors and their legal implications for water, writes a subject she had, as the original audience understood, more than theoretical acquaintance with. This one generated more response than the first, including a letter from a Cheyenne attorney named Foster, who asked if she had any interest in a formal consulting arrangement with his firm on land documents. She wrote back to him in the clear, precise language she used for everything that mattered, and said she was interested but had conditions, which she then detailed over 4 paragraphs. Foster wrote back that her conditions were accepted. She told Cornelius about the arrangement over supper on a Thursday evening, with James asleep in the next room and Clara Rose occupying herself in the quiet, intent way she had with a set of wooden blocks, and she presented it simply as information. "This is what I am doing. This is what it will require. I wanted you to know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you need to travel to Cheyenne?" "Occasionally," she said. "Once a quarter, perhaps, no more than a few days at a time." He considered this. He thought about the ranch, the children, the logistics. He thought about what it would mean for her, the engagement with serious legal work, the intellectual exercise, the use of what she had built in Denver applied to something beyond their immediate community. "Then we'll manage the days," he said. "Elias can stay close to the house when you're traveling." She looked at him with steady eyes. "You're certain? You built this skill over years," he said. "You should use it." He held her gaze. "I would not want to be the reason you didn't." What crossed her face in response to that was the expression he cherished most, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was real. The full, unguarded reality of Mabel Keller Granger, who almost never let anything show without meaning to show it, choosing to let this particular thing through. "I married exactly the right person," she said. "Yes," he said, "you did. So did I." The summer of 1890 brought a particular kind of abundance to the Sweetwater Basin. The snowpack had been heavy, the spring had been gentle, and the creek was running as full as anyone in the basin could remember seeing it in a decade. Mabel's drought records, 4 years into their compilation by then, formed a document that Dr. Patterson, who had become something of a reader of her published work, had recommended she present to the Wyoming State Agricultural Society following Wyoming's admission as a state in July of that year. Wyoming became the 44th state on July 10, 1890, and was notable, even in its earliest statehood, for having extended full voting rights to women since 1869, a fact that Mabel had grown up knowing and had always considered an appropriate and overdue recognition. The state's entry into the Union renewed conversation about these rights, And in the basin, as elsewhere, people had opinions in both directions about it. Mabel expressed her own opinion once, clearly at the 4th of July gathering, in response to a man named Hatch who had been loudly suggesting that women voting was an experimental mistake. She said, with perfect composure, that she had drafted legal agreements that had protected his neighbor's water access through 3 drought years, and that she considered herself adequately qualified to exercise a franchise. Hatch had no immediate reply. No one else raised the subject in her hearing for some time after. Cornelius, who had been standing nearby during this exchange, had turned to Elias Beck and said quietly, "And that is why." Elias Beck had said nothing, as was his custom, but the expression he wore suggested complete agreement. In September of 1890, the Wyoming State Agricultural Society invited Mabel to present her drought record methodology at their fall meeting in Cheyenne. She went, taking the compiled 4 years of measurements, the published articles, and the original contract template that had, by that point, been adopted in modified form by at least a dozen ranching operations across the state. Cornelius stayed with the children and the ranch, and wrote her a letter that she received at the hotel in Cheyenne, which contained 2 sentences. The first said he was proud of her in a way he could not fully express in written form and hoped the presentation went well. The second said that Clara Rose had attempted to explain to Howard the mule why he needed to be more cooperative, and that Howard had listened with apparent patience before walking away, which James had found so funny he'd nearly fallen off the fence. She had read the letter in her hotel room and laughed until her eyes were wet, which was not something that happened to Mabel Keller Granger very often, and was therefore all the more precious when it did. The presentation went well. Several society members asked her questions afterward that demonstrated they had read the published articles carefully, and one, a rancher from the northeastern part of the state named Caldwell, told her it was the most practically useful document he had seen in 20 years of dealing with water disputes. She thanked him and gave him Foster's address in Cheyenne, since Foster's firm was the appropriate formal channel, and came home on the stage 3 days later with a sense of having completed something worthwhile. Cornelius met her at the gate, which he had not told her he would do but which she found she was not surprised by, and the children were with him, James hanging off the gate post in the manner of a boy with too much energy and not enough fence to climb, Clara Rose standing composedly beside her father with one hand in his, and an expression that suggested she had organized this welcome herself. Mabel stepped down from the stage and Clara Rose walked forward with tremendous dignity to offer her the wildflower bunch she had been holding, which was a little crushed and missing some petals but was clearly a considered gift. "We picked them," Clara Rose said. "James picked the wrong ones twice." "They were not the wrong ones," James said indignantly from the gate. "They were dandelions," Clara Rose said, with the forensic precision of a 5-year-old who has been rehearsing this argument. Mabel crouched down and gathered her daughter and the battered flowers into her arms and held on for a moment. And then James arrived from the gate at the speed of a 6-year-old who has decided running was the correct response to most situations, and she caught him with her other arm. And Cornelius looked at the 3 of them from 2 steps away, with an expression that he would never have described out loud but that Elias Beck, who had seen many things in 6 years of working for Cornelius Granger, later described to Pete Dunmore as the look of a man who knew precisely what he had. He put his hand on her shoulder when she stood, and she looked up at him with the full, clear, warm expression that she kept for him and the children and the rare moments when she permitted herself to simply be rather than do. "Welcome home," he said. "It's good to be home," she said. They walked inside together, James talking without pause, Clara Rose maintaining her dignity, Howard visible in the pasture looking philosophically at the middle distance, and the last of the September light coming in warm and amber through the kitchen windows onto the table where, 6 years ago on a spring morning, A young woman had placed a 12-page legal document in front of a man who had assumed her silence meant she had no plan. It had not meant that. It had never meant that. It had meant she was working. And everything since. The argument, the correction, the agreement, the supper, the wagon ride, the stars over the basin, the shared winter work and the shared spring fence line, and the years of drought records and published articles and 2 children, and a life built on the same principles as the best contract she had ever drafted. Fair terms, mutual benefit, clear conditions, and the space for both parties to be exactly who they were. All of it had grown from that single morning's truth. Cornelius Granger had thought her silence meant she had no plan. Mabel Keller had presented him with 12 pages of proof that he was wrong. And in the long run, for both of them, being wrong had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened. The water rights agreement was renewed in its 5th year, in 1889, with 3 small amendments that both parties had agreed upon, and refiled in the new state system in 1890 following Wyoming's admission. It remained in effect for the duration of their ownership of both properties. The drought provision in Section 7 was invoked twice more over the following decade, each time functioning exactly as designed, without dispute, without resentment, and without any need for involvement from Judge Calloway, though Calloway always noted approvingly when someone mentioned it that it was the finest piece of local land law he had personally witnessed. Foster's firm in Cheyenne grew, and Mabel's consulting arrangement with it grew with it, and in 1892 the firm took on a new junior partner, a young woman from Laramie named Prentice, and Mabel drove to Cheyenne to meet her and found her sharp and careful and worth knowing, and told Foster so, and went home feeling that certain things, even slowly, were moving in the right direction. James grew into a rangy, good-natured young man who had his mother's eye for the physical world and his father's way of moving through a room, and by the time he was 16, was managing the fence line inspection for both properties with a competence that made Elias Beck say, with his characteristic understatement, that the boy would do. Clara Rose grew into herself with that same quiet force she had demonstrated from her earliest days, and showed, by the time she was 10, a pronounced aptitude for mathematics and a fascination with her mother's survey instruments that was clearly not going to resolve itself without formal education. Mabel began teaching her, and the 2 of them spent Saturday mornings in the east pasture with the instruments, and Cornelius would sometimes see them from the fence line, the tall woman and the dark-haired girl with their heads bent over the notebook, and feel something so whole and complete in his chest that it barely required a name. A second daughter arrived in 1893, born on an April morning with the same decisiveness her mother brought to everything she undertook. They named her Dorothy June Dorothy for Mabel's old friend from the Denver firm who had sent a wedding gift in 1884 and remained in correspondence through the years, and June for the month the creek ran fullest and the basin was most itself. Dorothy June had her father's gray eyes and her own particular personality, which announced itself early as curious, relentless, and utterly uncontainable, and which delighted everyone who came into contact with it. James, who was now 9, received his new sister with the gravity of an older brother who understands the responsibility and is fairly sure he was not consulted about it, and then spent 3 days working out how to make her laugh, which turned out to be the right approach. Clara Rose studied Dorothy June with the forensic attention she brought to all new phenomena, and then began reading to her at 6 weeks of age from whatever book was at hand, including on one occasion a survey manual which Cornelius privately thought was probably fine. The house grew, the land grew, the work grew and changed and continued. In 1896, Mabel was formally retained as a land documents consultant by the Wyoming State Land Board, the first woman to hold a formal consulting position with that body. The letter of appointment arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Cornelius noted, the same day of the week that August Keller had died, 12 years earlier. He pointed this out to her, and she looked at the letter and at him and said she thought her father would have found that appropriately organized. She was right. He would have. They celebrated that evening with the good wine that Cornelius had kept in the cellar for significant occasions. It was a bottle from California, brought up on the rail years ago, and it was the correct choice. And the children were at the table, and the kitchen was warm and full of the specific sound of a household that had built itself carefully and had more building still to do. Cornelius raised his glass. He looked at his wife across the table, across the years, across the documents and the fence lines and the drought records and all of it, the long, full, deliberate life they had made from a contract on a kitchen table. "To the best legal mind in Wyoming," he said. She raised her glass with the corner of the mouth expression, the real one, the one that was entirely her. "To the man who was smart enough to sign the agreement," she said. James said he didn't understand why that was funny, and Clara Rose explained it was because the grown-ups had a history, and Dorothy June banged her spoon on the table in general approbation, and Cornelius Granger laughed, the full, complete, grateful laugh of a man who was, in every way that mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be. The creek ran on through the basin, through every season it had run through before and every season it would run through after, and the boundary markers stood where Mabel had placed them, correct and true and filed in the proper record, and the Sweetwater Basin held them all: the working land, the working people, the careful agreements and the carefully built love in the long, particular silence of the Wyoming country, which is not the silence of emptiness, but of everything present and at rest. It had begun with 12 pages and the sound of a document landing on a table. It had become something that needed no contract at all because it was already exactly what it had always been intended to be: a fair arrangement, built to last.